It's all over the news that Pakistan may default on its debt, that it might go the Sri Lanka way, that Pakistan's bankruptcy is imminent. The latest doomsayer is the credit rating agency Fitch. It has downgraded Pakistan's issuer default rating to a CCC-. That's considered a junk rating. But what does all this mean? How can a country go bankrupt? How will it affect Pakistan's citizens? Let's start with understanding sovereign debt. Like any person or company, a country can borrow money. Since it's an independent sovereign nation, the debt is called sovereign debt. Why does Pakistan need to borrow money? For a host of things. Importing goods, building infrastructure, funding government schemes, all of it requires money. Why can't the Pakistani government use money it's collected through taxes? The short answer is that it doesn't generate enough. Its expenses are more than its revenues, so it needs to borrow money. So who does Pakistan borrow from? There are various sources for the funds. China, multiple Gulf nations, and the International Monetary Fund have all lent money to Pakistan. Countries also raise money through issuing government bonds. However a country raises it, there's always one rule with debt. Everyone has to pay back their loans at fixed intervals. So what happens when a country doesn't have the money to pay back its loans? What happens when a country's economy is on the brink, like in Pakistan's case? Usually, the consequences start before the country defaults. When a country is seen as unable to pay, its currency usually tanks. As it loses its value, the situation spirals. Since trade usually occurs in US dollars, essential imports become more expensive. The prices of food and fuel go up. This extra cost is passed on to citizens who face staggering inflation, something that's already happening in Pakistan. Since the government in crisis faces higher bills, it usually restricts imports. That's happening in Pakistan. The country's forex reserves aren't even enough to cover a month's worth of imports. Import restrictions translate to shortages. That's what happened in Sri Lanka, where people waited in long lines to get a bare minimum amount of petrol. Expensive food means many people are forced to go hungry. Imported medicines become scarce and the people suffer. For the country, additional funding becomes hard to come by. After all, why would anyone lend to a country likely to default? More hoops need to be jumped through to secure funding. Case in point, Pakistan and the IMF. The IMF has conditions that need to be met before it sends money. They want concrete steps taken, like raising taxes and cutting subsidies. Steps to fix the economy. These can be good for the economy, but increase the hardships of the common people. Austerity measures can be deeply unpopular and lead to citizens voting out the government in power. But to not do anything also invites public ire. People can take to the streets to demand regime change. The Sri Lanka protests are a recent example. Basically, the government is caught between a rock and a hard place. And no matter what, the people will suffer. Now let's look at what happens when a country goes bankrupt and can't pay its dues. This is called a sovereign default. First, this affects the country's reputation. All future loans will likely be more expensive. After all, the risks are high. And more loans will definitely be required. Defaults are the result of an economic crisis. The country needs to spend money to get out of its mess. It will need to borrow this money. The question then becomes, who will lend to it? Remember, previous lenders have already faced losses. Defaulting countries usually try and restructure the debt, which means partial repayments. Or they ask for debt rollovers, delaying loan repayments for some time. Either way, the lenders lose money. This means that economic recovery is difficult without staunch allies. Sri Lanka had India to help out. Greece had Europe. But what about Pakistan? Can it depend on China to bail it out when the time comes? Beijing seems to be dumping Islamabad, treating it like a bad investment. Pakistan is staring at a deal or default endgame. But the problem is, it can't find takers for any deal.